Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she had learned to sleep on the very edge of the bed. Not because she needed the space. Not because she tossed or turned. She did it because the closer she stayed to the edge, the farther she was from him. 7 years of marriage had trained her body like a soldier trains for war, always alert, always braced, always ready for the next blow that might come without warning in the dark. Marcus Whitfield was not the kind of man who left bruises where people could see them. He was smarter than that. He was a man who wore pressed shirts to church and shook the pastor's hand with a broad smile. He coached Little League on Saturdays and brought coffee to the neighbors when they were sick. The community of Millhaven, South Dakota saw a good man. Clara saw something else entirely. She saw the way his jaw tightened when dinner was 5 minutes late. She felt the grip on her wrist when she spoke out of turn at a party. She knew the silence that came before the storm, that cold, suffocating silence that pressed down on the house like a sky before a tornado. She had grown up in a small house not far from the Black Hills. Her mother had been a quiet woman too, a woman who kept her eyes down and her voice soft. Clara had always told herself she would never live that life. She had dreams once. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to fill a classroom with children who loved books as much as she did. But Marcus came along when she was 22, all charm and certainty, and the dreams got smaller and smaller until they disappeared altogether like smoke in open air. By the time Clara turned 30, she had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without watching someone's face first to make sure it was allowed. She had forgotten the feeling of walking into a room and not calculating the mood of the man in the corner. She had 3 miscarriages in those 7 years, and Marcus blamed each one on her, said she was too weak, too broken, too much of a failure even for the most basic human task. Those words buried themselves in her chest and stayed there, growing heavier every season. The night she finally left was not dramatic. There was no final blow-up, no cinematic moment of courage. She simply woke at 3 in the morning, and something inside her, something she thought had died years ago, whispered that it was time. She packed one bag. She took her grandmother's Bible, a change of clothes, and the $40 she had hidden inside a hollowed-out romance novel on the bottom shelf. She walked out the back door while Marcus slept, and she did not look back. She walked 3 miles to the highway and sat on a guardrail until the first truck driver stopped and asked where she was headed. She did not know. She just said north. The driver, a kind older woman named Ruth, took her as far as Pine Ridge. Clara had passed through the reservation once as a child on a road trip with her father, but she had never stopped, never spoken to anyone there. She had no connection to that land, no reason to be there. But when Ruth pulled over at a small diner just outside the reservation boundary and pressed a $20 bill into Clara's hand, Clara looked out the window at the vast, open plains stretching endlessly into the horizon, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt like she could breathe. There were no walls. There were no locked doors. There was just sky and grass and the smell of rain coming in from the west. She walked into that diner, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window as the sun came up over the hills. She pressed both hands flat against the table just to feel something solid. She was 30 years old, alone, with $60 and a single bag. She was the most terrified she had ever been. She was also, in some quiet and fragile way, free. She just did not know yet what to do with that freedom, or whether a woman like her, a woman who flinched at raised voices and trembled at sudden movement, could ever learn to trust the world again. The diner was called Roses, and it smelled like fry bread and burned coffee. Clara sat there for 4 hours, nursing 2 cups and watching the morning customers come and go. Ranchers with muddy boots. A young mother with twin toddlers who colored placemats with broken crayons. An elderly man in a battered cowboy hat who read the same newspaper page 3 times without turning it. Nobody looked at Clara too long. Nobody asked her questions. That suited her perfectly. It was near 11 when the door opened and a man walked in who was different from the others. Not in the way he was dressed. He wore simple dark jeans, worn boots, and a faded denim jacket. Not in his size, though he was tall and broad-shouldered in a way that once would have made Clara's heart go cold. What was different was the way he moved. He moved slowly. Deliberately. The way a man moves when he is completely at peace with wherever he is and wherever he is going. He greeted Rosie behind the counter by name, and Rose's whole face opened up like a door. He said something that made her laugh, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly, and then he turned and scanned the room the way a person does when they are looking for a familiar face. His eyes passed over Clara and then came back. Not in the way Marcus's eyes used to land on her, weighted with assessment, with judgment, with that particular coldness she had come to dread. This man's eyes were calm. Curious in a gentle way, the way a person looks at an unfamiliar bird that has landed on the fence post. He nodded once, as if acknowledging that she was a person who existed and that was perfectly fine, and then he sat down 2 tables away and ordered without looking at the menu. His name was Joseph Elk Standing, though most people on the reservation simply called him Standing. He was 54 years old, a Lakota Sioux elder and the recognized chief of his community, a title that carried both honor and weight. He had spent 30 years working with his people, building programs for youth, working with veterans returning from war with broken spirits, advocating in government offices where politicians kept making promises they never intended to keep. He was not a man of easy words. He was a man of precise words, spoken only when they were needed and always with the full force of intention behind them. He had noticed the woman by the window the moment he walked in, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a hollowed-out and faded way, like a painting left too long in the sun. He noticed her because of the way she held herself. Both hands flat on the table. Shoulders pulled in. Eyes that tracked every movement in the room without ever fully resting anywhere. He had seen that posture before, in veterans who came back from combat unable to sit in a room without mapping the exits. In young people who had grown up in homes where safety was never guaranteed. In his own sister, 30 years ago, before she finally found her way out of a marriage that had nearly taken her life. He did not approach Clara. He understood enough about wounded things to know that approach is often the last thing they need. Instead, he ate his lunch quietly and, when Rosie came to refill his coffee, he said something to her in a low voice. Rosie glanced at Clara's table and nodded. A few minutes later, Rosie set a plate of fried bread down in front of Clara without being asked. "On the house?" Rosie said simply. "You look like you could use something warm." Clara looked up, startled, her hands pulling back instinctively. But Rose's face was open and kind, the face of a woman who had seen hard things and come out the other side. Clara felt something shift in her chest, small, barely noticeable, like a frozen lock beginning to loosen. She thanked Rosie quietly and ate. When Standing got up to leave, he stopped at the counter to pay. On his way to the door, he paused at a respectful distance from Clara's table. He did not lean in. He did not reach out. He simply stood with his hands open at his sides, not in his pockets, not crossed over his chest, just open, and he said, "There's a women's support house on Oglala Road, about 2 miles east. Tell them Standing sent you. They will find you a safe place to sleep tonight." Then he nodded once and walked out the door. Clara sat very still. She stared at the fried bread on the plate in front of her. Then she looked down at her hands, still pressed flat against the table, and noticed for the first time that she had stopped shaking. The women's house on Oglala Road was a low brown building with a vegetable garden along one side and wind chimes made from old spoons hanging by the front door. A woman named Dorothy Running Bear answered when Clara knocked, took one look at her single bag and her hollow eyes, and stepped aside to let her in without asking a single question. That was the first mercy. There would be many more. Clara was given a small room with a window that faced east. There was a bed with a quilt made from fabric patches in deep red and blue and gold, a wooden dresser, and a small lamp that cast a warm orange light at night. It was the simplest room she had ever slept in, and it was the first room in 7 years where she closed her eyes without her whole body coiled like a spring. She still woke 3 times the first night, her heart hammering at sounds that turned out to be nothing, the wind, a dog barking somewhere far off, the house settling. But she woke in a room that was hers, with a locked door and no one on the other side of it who meant her harm. That alone felt like a miracle she had not earned. The house held 6 women at any given time. Some were Lakota, some were not. They all carried their damage differently, some wore it loudly, in angry words and sleepless nights, and some wore it quietly, folded neatly away behind polite smiles. Clara wore hers in her body. She startled at sudden movement. She couldn't bear anyone standing behind her. She couldn't accept a gift, a cup of tea, a plate of food, an offered sweater, without the immediate instinct to calculate what would be expected in return. Dorothy noticed all of this without commenting on it. That was her gift, the ability to see clearly and say nothing until the moment was right. She ran the house with a quiet authority that asked nothing from the women except that they contribute what they could and take what they needed. Some women cooked. Some cleaned. Clara, who had once loved to read and had not opened a book in years because Marcus said it was a waste of time, found herself drawn to the small bookshelf in the common room. She started with short things. Children's books, at first, simple stories with clear endings where good things happened and stayed that way. Then longer books. Then, slowly, books about women who had survived things. It was 2 weeks after she arrived that she saw Standing again. He came to the house on a Thursday morning with 2 boxes of groceries, which he carried in himself and set on the kitchen table without ceremony. Dorothy introduced him properly this time. Clara stayed near the doorway to the hall, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching. Standing set the boxes down and then turned to greet the other women in the kitchen. He spoke to each one by name. He remembered things, one woman's daughter's dance recital, another's job interview the week before. He listened when they answered, really listened, with his full body turned toward them and his eyes steady. He did not try to speak to Clara. But as he was leaving, he paused in the hallway near where she stood, and he said quietly, without looking directly at her, "The way you speak to a wild animal you are trying not to startle. There is a sunrise ceremony at the Eastern Ridge this Saturday. The women from the house are welcome. No obligation, no expectation. Just the morning." Then he was gone. Clara didn't go that Saturday. But she stood outside on the back step as the sun came up and watched the color come into the sky in long strips of orange and pink and pale gold, and she thought about what it meant to offer something with no obligation attached. In her marriage, everything had a cost. A kind word cost silence later. A gift cost obedience. Attention cost something she could not always name but always felt. The idea that a person could offer a thing and mean nothing by it except the offering itself, that was a concept so foreign to her that she had to sit with it for a long time. She went the following Saturday. She stood at the back of the small group gathered on the ridge, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, and watched the ceremony in silence. Standing stood at the front, speaking words in Lakota she didn't understand but felt in some place deeper than understanding. When it was over and the group began to talk quietly among themselves, he walked over to her. He stood at a comfortable distance, hands open at his sides the way she had first noticed in the diner, and he said, "You came." Just that. No praise, no pressure. Just the acknowledgement that she had chosen to show up. And somehow, those two words were the kindest thing anyone had said to Clara Whitfield in longer than she could remember. Spring came early to the Black Hills that year. The snow melted fast and the creeks ran loud and the grass came back green and fierce as if the earth had been holding it in all winter, just waiting for permission to release it. Clara had been at the women's house for 3 months. She had stopped sleeping on the edge of the bed. She had stopped mapping the exits every time she entered a room. She had not stopped flinching entirely, that would take much longer, and she was beginning to understand that healing did not happen in straight lines. It doubled back, circled around, sat down unexpectedly in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and refused to move. But she was learning to let it. She had begun helping Dorothy with the younger women who came through the house, women just arrived, just escaped, still vibrating with the particular terror of new freedom. Clara didn't try to give advice. She wasn't qualified for that, and she knew it. What she did was sit with them. She made tea. She asked what they wanted to read and found them books. She remembered their names the way Standing had taught her, not by trying to memorize, but by listening with the full weight of her attention. It was the first useful thing she had felt herself to be in years, and the feeling was terrifying and warm in equal measure. Her relationship with Standing had deepened slowly, in the way that rivers carve canyons, not through force, but through patient repetition. He came to the house twice a week. They began to talk in the kitchen after his supply drops, small conversations at first, about the weather and the community and the history of the land. Then longer ones, about things that mattered. He told her about the Lakota concept of mitikuya oyazain, all are related, and what it meant to move through the world understanding that every living thing was connected and owed a kind of reverence. He told her about his own losses. A son who had died young. A marriage that had ended not in violence but in the slow quiet grief of two people who loved each other but had grown into different shapes. He spoke of these things without shame, without drama, just as facts that had become part of who he was. Clara listened to all of it carefully. She noticed that Standing never touched anyone without asking first. When Dorothy's youngest grandchild ran to him and held up her arms, he bent down and said, "Can I pick you up?" to the toddler, who nodded enthusiastically. When he handed something to a person, he held it out and waited until they reached for it rather than pushing it toward them. These were small things. They were everything. One afternoon in April, Clara was in the kitchen cutting bread when the knife slipped and she cut her palm, not deep, but enough to bleed. Standing was at the table behind her. He stood up immediately, and her whole body went rigid without her permission, braced for the approach the way it had been trained to brace. He stopped. He said, calmly, "You're hurt. May I look at it?" She turned. His face held nothing but the question. She nodded. He came forward slowly, took her wrist in both hands with the kind of lightness that she had never associated with the hands of a man, careful, steady, precise, and he examined the cut, then walked to the cabinet and found the first aid kit and cleaned and bandaged it with the same focused gentleness. When he finished, He held her bandaged hand for just a moment in both of his, and he said, "You went somewhere just then." When I stood up. It was not a question. He had seen the flinch. He had seen the bracing. Clara looked at their hands, her small pale one enclosed in his broad brown ones, so still, so deliberate. She said, "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't apologize for what your body learned in order to keep you alive." He released her hand the moment she shifted, as if he had a sensor for exactly when holding became holding on to. And then he went back to his seat and picked up his coffee like nothing had happened, because nothing had happened except one small, careful act of kindness, freely given. Clara stood at the counter for a long moment after. She looked at the bandage on her hand. She thought about Marcus's hands, the weight of them, the unpredictability, the way her body had learned to read their position at all times the way a sailor reads the sky. Then she thought about Standing's hands. Open at his sides in the diner. Gentle on the wrist above the cut. Releasing the moment she needed to be released. She pressed the bandaged palm against her chest and let herself feel something she could not yet name, something small and green and new, pushing up through very old, very cold ground. By summer, Clara had found a part-time job at the Pine Ridge Community Library. It was small work, cataloging donations, helping children find books, reading to a group of elders on Wednesday afternoons who had lost their vision but not their love of stories. She earned enough to save a little, to think about a future for the first time in years without immediately abandoning the thought as something that belonged to a different person in a different life. The women's house had given her what it could. Now it was time to give back and, slowly, to move forward. She was still at the house, still sharing meals with Dorothy and the rotating group of women who passed through. But something in her had shifted. She could feel it in the way she walked into the library each morning, head up, steps unhurried. She could feel it in the way she no longer scanned every room for threat the moment she entered it. Old habits of fear do not vanish. They recede. They wait. But they lose their power when the present is made of different material, and Clara's present was slowly, deliberately being remade from something new. She and Standing talked openly now. He had become what she could only describe as a teacher, not of formal lessons, but of a way of being in the world that she had never been shown. He taught her that a person could be strong without using strength to diminish another. He taught her the difference between authority and dominance, that real authority came from the respect of people freely given, not from fear manufactured through pain. He told her once about a traditional Lakota practice in which elders would use their hands in healing ceremonies, laying them on the shoulders of the grieving, on the foreheads of the sick, on the backs of those setting out on difficult journeys, always with intention, always with the understanding that hands could either wound the world or hold it tenderly, and the choice was always the person's to make. She thought about that often. Hands as a choice. In late July, she received a letter from a lawyer in Millhaven. Marcus had filed for divorce, naming abandonment as the cause. She held the letter for a long time in the back room of the library, reading it twice. She waited for the fear, the cold, contracting terror that had always come with any communication from or about Marcus. Instead, what she felt was something quieter. A slow release of pressure, as if something that had been clenching in her chest for years had finally, carefully unclenched. She sat down at the little desk in the back room and she cried for a long time. Not because she was sad. Not entirely. She cried because she was finally, fully, undeniably safe, and her body was just now beginning to believe what her mind had known since that night she walked out the back door and never looked back. Standing was at the library that afternoon, returning a stack of books. He saw her face when she came out from the back room and he did not ask what happened. He simply sat down in one of the children's reading chairs. He was too big for it and it looked almost comical, and he picked up a picture book from the display shelf and started reading it quietly to himself. Clara came and sat across from him. They sat there for a long while in the light that came through the library window, him reading about a small bear finding his way home through the woods, her looking at the way the afternoon sun moved across the wooden floor. After a while, she told him about the letter. He listened the whole way through. When she finished, he set the book down and he said, "The Lakota say that when a wound finally heals, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the landscape. Like a scar on the earth where lightning once struck. Something grew there before, something will grow there again, and the ground will be richer for what passed through it." He paused. "You walked out of that house with nothing. Look what you grew from nothing." Then he reached across the table between them and set his hand open, palm up, not grabbing, not reaching, just offering, and she placed her hand in his. It was the first time she had chosen to touch someone in years. The first time a hand had felt like a place where safety lived. She didn't need it to mean more than it meant in that moment. Two people in a library in the late afternoon light, one of them learning what the other had always known, that the hands we hold out to others, open and unhurried and asking nothing in return, are sometimes the most powerful thing in the world. Clara Whitfield had known only pain from the hands of a man who called her his. A Lakota chief had shown her, with patience and with time, what gentle hands truly felt like. And in the learning, she had become, slowly and stubbornly and beautifully, whole again.